behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, when the last tourist has departed and London's Christmas lights twinkle in the winter darkness, something extraordinary happens. While millions of families gather around their own dinner tables on Christmas Eve, King Charles III maintains a tradition so secretive, so deeply rooted in centuries of royal protocol, that even his closest advisors whisper about it in hushed tones. This isn't the polished, camera-ready Christmas message the world sees each year. This is something far more intimate, more mysterious, and infinitely more revealing about the man who wears the crown. What happens behind those palace walls on the most sacred night of the year has remained one of the monarchy's best-kept secrets for over 2 centuries. Tonight, you're about to discover why King Charles would rather face public scrutiny than abandon this ancient feast, and how a single Christmas Eve tradition reveals more about the true nature of royalty than any official biography ever could. The truth will surprise you, challenge everything you thought you knew about the modern monarchy, and perhaps make you see Christmas Eve in an entirely different light. Some secrets are worth keeping. Others are worth telling. This is one story that has waited long enough to be revealed. The grandfather clock in the palace's grand corridor had just struck 10 when King Charles III made his way through the dimly lit hallways toward the Queen's private dining room. His footsteps echoed softly against the marble floors, the only sound breaking the unusual quiet that had settled over Buckingham Palace on this Christmas Eve of 2023. The staff had been dismissed hours earlier, the official staterooms locked and secured, and even his closest protection officers had been instructed to maintain their distance. Charles carried with him a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by generations of royal hands. Inside lay the key to a tradition that had been carefully guarded for more than 200 years, a secret feast that no photographer had ever captured, no journalist had ever witnessed, and no official record had ever documented. The origins of this mysterious Christmas Eve gathering stretched back to King George III, Charles's distant predecessor who ruled during some of Britain's most turbulent times. In 1782, as America celebrated its independence and European powers shifted like pieces on a chessboard, George III faced a crisis that threatened to tear his family apart. His eldest son, the future King George IV, had been caught in a scandal involving secret marriages and mounting debts that could have destroyed the monarchy's reputation. On that bitter Christmas Eve over 2 centuries ago, George III made a decision that would echo through generations. Instead of addressing his son's troubles through official channels or public pronouncements, he chose a different path. He invited his entire family to a private feast, but not in any of the grand staterooms where protocol demanded royal meals be served. Instead, he led them to a small chamber that had once served as a servants' dining hall, a room so modest that visiting dignitaries would never have imagined royalty setting foot inside. The message was clear without being spoken. On this night, they would not be kings and princes, dukes and duchesses. They would simply be a family, sharing a meal in circumstances that reminded them of their humanity. George III understood something that many rulers before and after him had failed to grasp. The crown was a burden that could only be carried by those who remembered what it meant to be human beneath its weight. That first secretive feast lasted until dawn. Father and son spoke words that had been trapped behind years of royal protocol and public expectations. When they emerged from that humble room as Christmas morning broke over London, the crisis that had threatened the monarchy had been quietly resolved, not through political maneuvering or public relations, but through the simple act of a family sharing honest conversation over a meal. George III established 3 unbreakable rules for this annual gathering. First, no servants would be present during the meal. The royal family would prepare and serve their own food, a revolutionary concept for its time. Second, no official business would be discussed. The weight of the crown would be set aside for these precious hours. Third, and perhaps most importantly, no record of what was said or done during this feast would ever be kept. It would exist only in the memories of those present, making it perhaps the only truly private moment in the lives of people whose every action was otherwise documented and scrutinized. As Charles made his way through the palace corridors on this Christmas Eve, he carried with him the weight of this tradition and the wisdom of his ancestors who had understood its importance. The small dining room he approached had remained virtually unchanged since that first gathering in 1782. The same oak table sat in its center, bearing the scratches and stains of 2 centuries of royal meals. The same simple wooden chairs surrounded it, their cushions replaced countless times but their basic form preserved. Even the fireplace remained the same, its stones blackened by fires that had warmed kings and queens through wars, celebrations, and personal crises that had shaped the course of history. But the room held more than just furniture and memories. It contained the accumulated wisdom of generations who had faced impossible choices, weathered public scandals, and learned to balance the demands of duty with the needs of the human heart. Each Christmas Eve feast had added its own layer to this repository of royal experience, creating a tradition that served as both sanctuary and school for those who wore the crown. Charles had first participated in this feast as a young boy, brought by his mother Queen Elizabeth II, who had inherited the tradition from her father, King George VI. He remembered the confusion he had felt at seeing his usually formal grandmother, Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, rolling up her sleeves to help prepare vegetables in the small kitchen adjacent to the dining room. He had watched in amazement as his mother, always so composed in public, laughed until tears streamed down her face at a story his great-uncle shared about a mishap during his military service. Those early experiences had taught Charles something no amount of formal education could have provided. He learned that the strength of the monarchy came not from the pageantry and protocol that surrounded it, but from the very human connections that bound the royal family together. The Christmas Eve feast was where future kings learned that their greatest power lay not in commanding others, but in understanding themselves and those they would one day serve. The tradition had survived world wars, political upheavals, and personal tragedies that had shaken the monarchy to its foundations. During World War II, as bombs fell on London and the future of the kingdom remained uncertain, the royal family had gathered in this same room, finding strength in their connection to each other and to the generations who had faced their own dark hours with courage and grace. Now, as Charles approached the door to the dining room, he reflected on how this tradition had shaped him as a man and as a future king. Some of his most important decisions had been influenced by conversations that had taken place around that ancient oak table. His understanding of duty, his commitment to service, and his deep love for the British people had all been nurtured during those precious hours when the weight of the crown could be set aside and honest conversation could flow freely. He paused at the door, knowing that on the other side waited not just a meal, but a continuation of a conversation that had been ongoing for more than 2 centuries. Tonight, he would add his own voice to that dialogue, sharing his hopes and fears with family members who understood the unique challenges of royal life in ways that no one outside the palace walls ever could. The wooden box in his hands contained more than just a key. It held the promise that some things in this rapidly changing world would remain constant, that the wisdom of the past would continue to guide the future, and that even kings and queens needed a place where they could simply be human. As Charles turned the key and opened the door to the Queen's private dining room, he stepped not just into a physical space, but into a tradition that had sustained the British monarchy through its greatest challenges and would continue to do so for generations yet to come. Inside the Queen's private dining room, Charles found Prince William already at work in the small adjacent kitchen, his sleeves rolled up and his hands covered in flour. The future King of England was attempting to recreate the traditional Christmas bread that had been served at every feast since George III's time, following a handwritten recipe that had been passed down through generations of royal hands. "The yeast isn't cooperating," William said with a grin that reminded Charles of his own struggles with the same recipe decades earlier. "I'm beginning to understand why great-grandmother always insisted we start preparing 3 hours before anyone else arrives." Charles smiled as he hung his jacket on a simple wooden peg, the same peg where his mother had hung her coat during countless Christmas Eves before her passing. The kitchen was remarkably modest for a royal residence, equipped with basic appliances that any middle-class family might have in their home. This had been intentional from the beginning. George III had wanted to ensure that the preparation of this feast would require genuine effort and cooperation, not the effortless luxury that characterized most royal dining experiences. The bread recipe that William struggled with told its own story of royal persistence and humility. It had been created by Queen Charlotte, George III's wife, who had insisted on contributing something meaningful to that first feast in 1782. Charlotte had spent weeks working with the palace's head baker, not to create something elaborate and impressive, but to develop a simple bread that could be made by inexperienced hands working together in a small space. The recipe had evolved slightly over the years, with each generation adding their own small touches. Queen Victoria had introduced herbs from her private garden. King Edward VII had suggested modifications that made the dough easier to handle. Even Queen Elizabeth II had made her contribution, adjusting the rising time to accommodate the modern ovens that had eventually been installed in the small kitchen. But the essence of Charlotte's original creation remained unchanged. The bread required patience, cooperation, and the willingness to accept that perfection was less important than the effort made together. More than one future monarch had learned valuable lessons about leadership while wrestling with stubborn dough on Christmas Eve, discovering that some of the most important work could not be delegated to others. Princess Anne arrived next, carrying a basket of vegetables from the organic gardens at Highgrove House, Charles's country estate. These gardens represented more than just a source of fresh ingredients for the feast. They embodied Charles's lifelong commitment to sustainable agriculture and environmental stewardship, principles that had often put him at odds with political and business leaders but had ultimately proven to be ahead of their time. The vegetables and broth told their own story of royal evolution and adaptation. When Charles had first begun advocating for organic farming in the 1970s, he had been ridiculed by the agricultural establishment and criticized by the press as an eccentric prince pursuing impractical hobbies. But he had persisted, driven by a vision of farming that worked in harmony with nature rather than against it. The Christmas Eve feast had become a celebration of this commitment to the land. Every vegetable served had been grown without chemicals or artificial fertilizers. Every herb had been cultivated using methods that enriched rather than depleted the soil. The connection between the royal family and the earth that sustained them was made tangible in the simple act of preparing and sharing food that had been grown with care and respect for natural processes. Anne began washing the vegetables in the small sink, her movements efficient and practiced. She had been attending these feasts longer than anyone else present, having first participated as a teenager when her grandmother, Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, had taught her the importance of the tradition. And had learned to appreciate the way this annual gathering stripped away the formality that usually surrounded royal life, allowing family relationships to develop in ways that would have been impossible under the constant scrutiny of public attention. The Princess Royal had always been known for her no-nonsense approach to royal duties, but the Christmas Eve feast revealed a different side of her character. Here, away from the cameras and protocol officers, Anne's dry wit and genuine warmth created an atmosphere that put everyone at ease. She had a gift for asking exactly the right questions to draw out family members who might otherwise remain guarded, helping to create the honest conversations that were the heart of this tradition. Prince Edward arrived shortly after his sister, carrying a bottle of wine from a vineyard that had been producing exceptional vintages on royal land for over 3 centuries. The wine represented yet another connection between the royal family and the land they were privileged to steward. The vineyard had weathered the same historical storms that had tested the monarchy, surviving wars, economic downturns, and changing tastes to continue producing wine that captured the essence of its particular corner of England. Edward had taken a special interest in the vineyard's operation, learning not just about wine production but about the generations of families who had worked the land and cared for the vines. Their stories had taught him about the kind of loyalty and dedication that could not be commanded but had to be earned through consistent care and respect for those who served. The wine that Edward uncorked had been chosen not for its monetary value or prestigious label, but for its connection to the land and the people who had worked to create it. Each bottle represented months of careful attention from planting to harvest, a reminder that the best things in life could not be rushed or manufactured but required patience, skill, and respect for natural processes. As the family members worked together in the small kitchen, they followed protocols that had been established over 2 centuries of Christmas Eve feasts. The eldest member present would oversee the preparation of the main course, ensuring that traditional methods were followed and that younger family members learned the proper techniques. The youngest adults would be responsible for the side dishes, working under the guidance of more experienced relatives who could share both cooking tips and family stories. The preparation itself was as important as the meal that would eventually be served. Working together in the confined space required cooperation, communication, and the willingness to set aside individual preferences for the good of the group. Future monarchs learned about compromise and collaboration not through formal instruction but through the practical necessity of creating a meal together. Charles took charge of preparing the main course, a recipe that had been adapted from a dish served at royal feasts during medieval times but simplified to accommodate the modest cooking facilities and limited time available. The dish required careful timing and constant attention, skills that translated surprisingly well to the demands of royal leadership. A monarch had to learn when to be patient, when to take action, and how to balance multiple competing priorities while maintaining focus on the ultimate goal. The conversations that flowed during these preparations often proved as nourishing as the food being created. Family members shared updates on their various charitable endeavors, discussed challenges they were facing in their public roles, and sought advice on personal matters that they could not discuss with anyone outside the royal circle. The informal atmosphere created by working together made it easier to address difficult topics and offer support in ways that would have felt forced or artificial in more formal settings. Sophie, Edward's wife, arrived with Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte, the youngest members of the royal family who were old enough to participate in the feast preparations. Their presence brought energy and laughter to the kitchen, reminding the adults of the joy and wonder that Christmas should represent. The children were given simple tasks appropriate to their ages, but their inclusion in the tradition ensured that the next generation would understand the importance of family connections that transcended royal titles and public duties. As the evening progressed and the meal neared completion, Charles reflected on how this annual gathering had shaped his understanding of leadership and service. The lessons learned in this small kitchen had proven more valuable than many formal briefings and official ceremonies. Here, he had learned that true leadership required humility, that effective communication often happened during shared activities rather than formal meetings, and that the strength of any institution ultimately depended on the quality of relationships between the people who comprised it. As midnight approached and Christmas Day officially began, the royal family gathered around the ancient oak table that had witnessed more than 2 centuries of intimate conversations, family revelations, and moments of profound connection. The candles they had lit cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere that seemed to blur the lines between past and present, inviting the spirits of previous generations to join this sacred gathering. Charles took his place at the head of the table, not because protocol demanded it, but because the family had chosen to honor his new role as king following his mother's passing the previous year. This was his first Christmas Eve feast as the reigning monarch, and the weight of that responsibility mingled with memories of all the times he had sat in different chairs around the same table, learning from those who had carried this burden before him. Queen Camilla sat beside him, bringing her own perspective to this ancient tradition. She had first attended the feast as Charles's wife just a few years earlier, initially uncertain about her place in a ritual that was so deeply rooted in centuries of royal history. But she had quickly discovered that the informal atmosphere and genuine warmth of the gathering made room for everyone who came with an open heart and willingness to contribute to the family bond. Camilla had learned about the tradition's power during her first feast, when Princess Anne had shared a story about Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother's determination to continue hosting these gatherings even during the darkest days of World War II. Even as bombs fell on London and the future of the monarchy remained uncertain, the Queen Mother had insisted that the family needed this anchor of continuity and connection more than ever. She used to say that traditions weren't meant to be preserved in glass cases like museum pieces, and had told Camilla that night. They were meant to be lived, experienced, and passed on through the act of participation. If we stopped gathering because times were difficult, we would lose more than just a family dinner. We would lose a piece of our identity that no amount of ceremony or protocol could replace. Tonight, as Charles began the meal with the traditional words that George III had spoken at that first feast in 1782, Camilla understood the profound truth in those words. The simple phrase, "Let us remember that we are family first, and history will judge us by how we care for one another," had been passed down through 8 generations of monarchs, connecting this moment to all the Christmas Eves that had come before. Prince William raised his glass of the estate wine, following the custom of offering the first toast to those who could not be present. This year, the toast carried special poignancy as the family remembered Queen Elizabeth II, whose absence was felt keenly around the table where she had shared so many stories and offered so much wisdom over the decades. "To her late Majesty," William said, his voice carrying both grief and gratitude. "Who taught us that the crown is not a privilege to be enjoyed but a responsibility to be shared, and that the strongest kingdoms are built on the foundation of strong families." The family drank in silence, each member lost in their own memories of the woman who had guided them through triumph and tragedy with unwavering grace and wisdom. Elizabeth II had understood the importance of this tradition in ways that went far beyond maintaining family connections. She had recognized that these intimate gatherings provided essential preparation for the public roles that each family member would be called upon to fulfill. As the meal progressed, the conversation flowed in the organic way that characterized these special gatherings. Unlike formal royal dinners where topics were carefully planned and conversations followed prescribed patterns, the Christmas Eve feast allowed for the kind of spontaneous dialogue that revealed character and built genuine relationships. Edward began sharing a story about his recent visit to a youth center in Manchester, where he had met teenagers who were working to create positive change in their communities despite facing significant personal challenges. His voice carried admiration for young people who had shown resilience and determination that inspired even those born into privilege and comfort. "One young woman told me that leadership isn't about having all the answers," Edward said, carefully cutting his portion of the traditional bread that William had successfully managed to complete. "She said it's about asking the right questions and caring enough about the people you serve to listen to their responses." It struck me that she understood something fundamental about service that took me years to learn. Princess Anne nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the wisdom in those words from her own decades of charitable work. She had learned similar lessons through her involvement with numerous organizations, particularly those focused on education and opportunity for young people. Her experiences had taught her that the most effective royal support came not from grand gestures or large donations, but from consistent attention and genuine interest in the work being done by others. "The young people I work with have taught me more about courage than any military training ever could," and said, her words carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades learning from those she was meant to serve. "They face challenges we can barely imagine, yet they continue to work for better futures for themselves and their communities. Their example reminds me why this work matters and why we must never take our responsibilities lightly." The conversation shifted naturally to the broader challenges facing the kingdom and the world. Climate change, economic inequality, technological disruption, and social division all demanded thoughtful responses from leaders at every level of society. The royal family found themselves uniquely positioned to influence public discourse and encourage positive action, but they also recognized the limitations of their role and the importance of supporting others who were doing the detailed work of creating change. Charles spoke about his decades-long advocacy for environmental protection and sustainable development, reflecting on how ideas that had once been considered radical or impractical had gradually gained acceptance and support. His persistence in promoting organic agriculture, renewable energy, and conservation had often put him at odds with established interests, but he had learned that meaningful change required both patience and determination. "I used to think that having the right ideas was enough," Charles admitted, his words carrying the weight of hard-won experience. "I've learned that ideas only matter if you can help others understand why they should care about them. Leadership requires the ability to connect with people's hopes and concerns, not just their rational analysis of problems and solutions." William shared his own evolving understanding of the royal role in modern society, describing how his work with homeless prevention and mental health awareness had taught him about the complex interconnections between individual struggles and broader social issues. He had learned that effective advocacy required deep knowledge of the problems being addressed and genuine relationships with those who were doing the daily work of creating solutions. "The hardest lesson I've learned is that we can't fix everything, no matter how much we might want to," William said, his honesty reflecting the kind of self-awareness that had been fostered by decades of Christmas Eve conversations around the same table. "Our job is to use our platform to highlight important work being done by others and to encourage public support for efforts that might otherwise remain invisible." Catherine, William's wife, contributed her own insights from her work with early childhood development and family support programs. She had discovered that some of the most important interventions happened in the earliest years of life, when proper support could prevent problems that would be much more difficult to address later. Her research and advocacy had helped shift public attention to prevention rather than just treatment, demonstrating the kind of long-term thinking that characterized the most effective royal initiatives. The conversation continued through multiple courses, touching on personal challenges as well as public responsibilities. Family members shared their struggles with balancing private desires and public duties, offering each other support and advice based on their shared understanding of the unique pressures of royal life. Young Princess Charlotte, though still a child, listened carefully to these conversations, beginning to understand the weight of responsibility that came with her heritage. Her questions revealed a thoughtful nature and a genuine interest in understanding how she could contribute to the family's mission of service. The adults took care to answer her inquiries honestly while ensuring that she could still enjoy the wonder and excitement appropriate to her age. Prince Louis, younger still, brought laughter to the table with his observations about the world around him and his innocent questions about topics that adults had learned to take for granted. His presence reminded everyone that the ultimate purpose of all their work was to create a better world for future generations, a goal that required both immediate action and long-term thinking. As the evening deepened and moved past midnight into the early hours of Christmas morning, the conversation around the ancient oak table began to touch on the deeper questions that shaped royal thinking and decision-making. The candles had burned lower, creating an even more intimate atmosphere that encouraged the kind of honest reflection that rarely happened in any other setting. Charles found himself sharing thoughts about kingship that he had never expressed publicly, discussing the profound loneliness that came with ultimate responsibility and the constant awareness that his decisions would affect millions of people he would never meet. The weight of the crown was not just symbolic, it was a daily reality that influenced every choice, every word, and every public appearance. "There are moments when I wake at 3 a.m, thinking about a decision I must make or a problem I'm supposed to help solve," Charles admitted, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had carried heavy responsibilities for decades. "The hardest part isn't making the decisions themselves. It's knowing that whatever I choose, there will be consequences that extend far beyond my own life or even my own reign." This vulnerability from the king opened the door for others to share their own struggles with the burdens of royal duty. Prince William spoke about the challenge of raising children who would grow up in the public eye, trying to give them as normal a childhood as possible while preparing them for lives of service that would demand extraordinary sacrifices. I watch Charlotte and Louis playing together, being silly and carefree, and I want to protect that innocence for as long as possible, William said, his love for his children evident in every word. But I also know that they need to understand gradually what their lives will require of them. Finding that balance between protection and preparation is one of the hardest aspects of being a royal parent. Catherine added her own perspective on this challenge, describing how she and William worked to ensure their children understood that privilege came with responsibility, but also that they were loved unconditionally for who they were as individuals, not just for the roles they would one day fulfill. We want them to know that their worth doesn't depend on their royal titles or their future responsibilities, Catherine explained. They need to develop their own sense of identity and purpose, understanding that the best service comes from authentic conviction, not just duty imposed from outside. Princess Anne reflected on her own experience growing up in the royal family during a time when expectations for royal children were quite different. She had learned through trial and error how to balance personal authenticity with public responsibility, developing a direct communication style that sometimes challenged traditional royal protocol but ultimately served her well in her charitable work. I made plenty of mistakes along the way, and acknowledged with characteristic honesty. But those mistakes taught me that people respond to genuineness more than perfection. The most important lesson I learned was that serving others effectively requires understanding your own strengths and limitations, then finding ways to contribute that feel authentic to who you are as a person. The conversation turned to the broader changes in society that had affected how the royal family approached their roles. Social media, 24-hour news cycles, and changing public expectations had created new challenges that required constant adaptation while maintaining the core values that had sustained the monarchy through previous periods of transformation. Edward shared insights from his work in media and entertainment, describing how these industries had evolved to create more immediate and personal connections with audiences. He had learned valuable lessons about communication that had influenced his approach to royal duties, helping him find ways to make traditional ceremonies and charitable work more accessible and relevant to contemporary audiences. The fundamental goal hasn't changed, Edward noted. We still want to serve the public good and support important causes. But the methods for achieving those goals have to evolve with the times. What worked for previous generations might not be effective today, and what works today might not be appropriate tomorrow. Sophie contributed her own observations about the changing role of women in society and how these changes had affected expectations for female members of the royal family. Her own background outside the traditional aristocratic circles had given her a different perspective on royal service, and she had worked to bring that fresh viewpoint to her charitable endeavors. I think one advantage of coming to the royal family from outside is that I never took the protocols and traditions for granted, Sophie reflected. I had to learn why things were done certain ways, which helped me understand which traditions served important purposes and which might need to be reconsidered for modern circumstances. The family also discussed the delicate balance between maintaining their privacy and fulfilling their public responsibilities. Each member had learned hard lessons about the costs of constant public attention, but they had also discovered that strategic openness about their work and values could help them connect more effectively with the people they served. Camilla shared her own journey of learning to navigate public scrutiny while remaining true to her values and commitments. Her experience had taught her that consistency and patience were more important than trying to please everyone, and that public opinion would eventually align with authentic service if that service was sustained over time. I learned that you can't control how people perceive you, but you can control how you respond to their perceptions, Camilla said. The most important thing is to keep focusing on the work that matters and trust that good intentions combined with persistent effort will eventually be recognized and appreciated. The conversation also touched on the future of the monarchy itself, acknowledging that each generation needed to prove its relevance and value to contemporary society. The family discussed how they could best prepare for the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead, recognizing that the institution they represented would need to continue evolving while maintaining its core commitment to service. Charles spoke about his vision for a monarchy that could serve as a unifying force in an increasingly divided world, promoting dialogue and understanding while supporting efforts to address the major challenges facing humanity. He recognized that this vision would require careful balance between leadership and humility, between tradition and innovation. The monarchy only matters if it serves a purpose that people value, Charles observed. We have to earn our relevance through consistent service and by demonstrating that we can contribute to solutions for problems that people care about. The crown is not an end in itself, it's a tool for service, and, like any tool, its value depends on how effectively it's used. William added his own thoughts about generational change within the royal family, expressing his commitment to learning from the wisdom of previous generations while adapting that wisdom to meet contemporary challenges. He spoke about the responsibility he felt to prepare for his eventual role as king while continuing to grow and learn from his current experiences. "I have the enormous privilege of learning from people who have carried these responsibilities before me," William said, glancing at his father with evident respect and affection. "But I also know that my reign will face challenges that previous monarchs never had to consider. My job is to absorb as much wisdom as I can while developing my own understanding of how to serve effectively in changing circumstances." As dawn began to break over London and Christmas morning officially arrived, the family prepared to conclude their feast with the traditional closing ritual that had ended every Christmas Eve gathering since George III established the tradition. Each member would share one hope for the coming year, creating a collective vision that would guide their individual efforts in the months ahead. The hopes they shared reflected both personal aspirations and broader commitments to service, revealing the interconnected nature of their private lives and public responsibilities. Their words carried the weight of genuine conviction, shaped by hours of honest conversation and mutual support around a table that had witnessed similar expressions of hope and determination across more than 2 centuries of royal service. As the first light of Christmas morning filtered through the small windows of the Queen's private dining room, the royal family prepared for the closing ritual that would mark the end of another chapter in their centuries-old tradition. The candles had burned down to small pools of wax, and the ancient oak table bore the comfortable evidence of a meal shared in warmth and intimacy rather than formal ceremony. Charles rose from his chair and walked to a small wooden cabinet that stood against the far wall, its surface bearing the same worn patina as the table around which they had gathered. Inside this cabinet lay the collection of written hopes that had been shared at the conclusion of every Christmas Eve feast since Queen Victoria had introduced this practice in the 1840s. Each piece of paper represented a moment of vulnerability and aspiration from someone who wore or would wear the crown, creating a repository of royal dreams and commitments that span nearly 2 centuries. Victoria had begun this practice following the death of Prince Albert, when grief threatened to overwhelm her sense of purpose and connection to her subjects. Her first written hope, preserved in her own careful handwriting, had been simple but profound: that I might learn to serve my people's needs rather than my own desires, finding in their welfare the comfort that has been taken from my personal happiness. The hopes that followed from subsequent generations revealed the evolution of royal thinking and the changing challenges each era had brought. King Edward VII had written about his desire to build bridges between Britain and other European nations. King George V had expressed his hope for the strength to guide his people through the Great War. King George VI had shared his prayer for courage to overcome the speech difficulties that made his public duties so challenging. Queen Elizabeth II had contributed dozens of these written hopes over her long reign, chronicling her growth from a young woman thrust unexpectedly into queenship to a seasoned monarch who had learned to balance tradition with necessary change. Her early hopes had focused on proving herself worthy of the throne, while her later entries revealed a mature understanding of service that had guided the monarchy through decades of social and political transformation. Now it was Charles's turn to add his voice to this collection, writing down the hope that had crystallized in his mind during the long night of conversation and reflection. His words would join those of his ancestors, creating another link in the chain of commitment that bound past, present, and future together in common purpose. "I hope," Charles wrote carefully, "to be remembered not for the length of my reign or the grandeur of my ceremonies, but for the small acts of service that helped my people believe in their own capacity for goodness and positive change. May I have the wisdom to know when to lead and when to follow, when to speak and when to listen, and always the courage to choose what serves the greater good over what serves my personal comfort." William followed his father's example, taking up the pen to record his own aspiration for the year ahead. His words reflected the careful balance he had learned to maintain between preparing for future responsibilities and fully engaging with current opportunities for service. "My hope is to raise children who understand that privilege is a responsibility to serve others, not a license to serve themselves," William wrote. "And may I continue learning how to use my platform to support those who are working to solve problems rather than those who are content merely to discuss them." Catherine added her own hope, focusing on her growing understanding of how the earliest years of life shaped human potential and her commitment to supporting families in giving their children the best possible foundation for future success and happiness. Princess Anne's hope revealed her characteristic directness and practical focus, to continue finding ways to be useful rather than merely ornamental, and to help others discover that meaningful work is one of life's greatest sources of satisfaction and dignity. Edward and Sophie shared hopes that reflected their own evolving understanding of how to balance family life with public service, while Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte were invited to share their wishes in pictures rather than words, their artistic expressions capturing the wonder and optimism that the adults worked to preserve and protect. As each family member added their contribution to the collection, Charles reflected on how this simple practice had helped sustain the monarchy through its greatest challenges. The written hopes served as both accountability measures and sources of inspiration, reminding each monarch of the commitments they had made in moments of honest reflection and providing guidance during difficult decisions throughout the year. The tradition had evolved over the decades to include not just written hopes but also specific commitments to actions that would help achieve those aspirations. Family members shared their plans for new charitable initiatives, described goals for personal growth and learning, and made pledges to support each other's efforts in the year ahead. This year's commitments reflected the unique challenges facing the monarchy in the early 21st century. The family discussed plans for increased engagement with young people, initiatives to address climate change and environmental degradation, and efforts to promote understanding and cooperation between different communities within Britain and around the world. Charles announced his intention to expand the Prince's Trust model to reach even more young people facing significant barriers to employment and education. William shared plans for new initiatives focused on homelessness prevention and mental health support. Catherine described her growing involvement in early childhood development research and program support. The family also made collective commitments to each other, promising to maintain the honest communication that characterized their Christmas Eve gatherings throughout the year. They pledged to support each other through the inevitable challenges and criticisms that would come with public service, and to remember that their strength as an institution came from their strength as a family. As the formal conclusion of the feast approached, Charles took a moment to address the profound changes the monarchy had undergone in recent years and the changes that lay ahead. The transition from Elizabeth II's reign to his own had been handled with the dignity and continuity that the British people expected, but Charles recognized that his reign would need to establish its own character and purpose. "We are stewards of something much larger than ourselves," Charles said, his words carrying the weight of deep reflection and genuine humility. "This institution has survived and served for over 1,000 years not because it remained unchanged, but because each generation found ways to adapt its methods while preserving its essential purpose. Our job is to be worthy of that inheritance and to pass it on stronger than we found it." The closing moments of the feast were marked by the same quiet dignity that had characterized the entire gathering. Family members embraced each other with genuine affection, strengthened by hours of honest conversation and mutual support. They began the simple process of cleaning up after themselves, following the tradition that no servants would be involved in any aspect of this private gathering. As they worked together to clear the table and wash the dishes, their conversation turned to lighter topics and shared memories of previous Christmas Eve feasts. They recalled moments of laughter and tears, breakthrough conversations that had changed perspectives, and quiet insights that had influenced major decisions. These shared memories created bonds that no amount of formal protocol could replicate. Charles was the last to leave the dining room, taking a moment to appreciate the space that had nurtured so many important conversations and relationships. He understood that this room represented something essential about the monarchy's ability to balance public grandeur with private authenticity, ceremonial tradition with genuine human connection. The Christmas Eve feast had once again served its intended purpose, strengthening the family bonds that enabled effective public service while providing each member with the emotional and spiritual resources needed to face the challenges ahead. The tradition would continue as long as the monarchy existed, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining its essential character. As Charles turned off the lights and secured the room for another year, he carried with him renewed confidence in the institution he led and the family that made that leadership possible. The feast had reminded him that the crown's greatest power lay not in commanding obedience but in inspiring service, not in demanding reverence but in earning respect through consistent commitment to the common good. The tradition would live on, connecting future generations to the wisdom of the past while encouraging them to find their own authentic ways of serving their people. The Christmas Eve feast had proven once again that some secrets were worth keeping not because they concealed wrongdoing, but because they protected something precious and irreplaceable in an increasingly public world. Outside the palace walls, London awakened to Christmas morning, unaware of the ancient ritual that had just concluded in their service. The royal family would soon return to their public roles, strengthened by the private connections that made their public service both possible and meaningful. The secret feast had ended, but its influence would continue throughout the year ahead, shaping decisions and inspiring actions that would serve the British people and the broader world in ways both seen and unseen.